Charles, so question regarding proving that someone is an executive. Okay. The
Hmm.
L-1A is available to executives so that they can transfer over to the United States and start expanding their business in the US, right? So, my main question might be a two-part question is number one, how do you prove that someone is an executive, right? So, are we showing that, he was mainly or she was mainly sending out emails with instructions to subordinates, right? And then the other question that I have is, we have a lot of clients that were taking dividends from the company rather than salaries, right? Does
Hmm.
that negate their ability to receive an L1 visa, right? They are the owner of the company, but they were not on the salary. So,
Right.
yeah,
Well,
let's
let's
dive
start with
into that.
the second question first. That answers a
Okay.
little bit shorter, and then we'll go to the first one.
Okay.
So, and that happens oftentimes, right? People, especially owners, they just take owner draws or dividends and stuff like that, and they don't necessarily pay themselves a steady salary. That's a bit problematic because, as you probably know, to get an L-1A, we have to show that you're not just a shareholder who's entitled to receiving dividends, but you're actually an executive, meaning you're like the CEO, CFO, high level manager, and you're actually performing services for the company for which theoretically you're receiving a salary. So if you're only getting dividends, that the payment of dividends is generally related to your being the owner of the company, right? You're a shareholder of a corporation, Microsoft, whatever, you get some dividends at the end of the year. You don't work for the company, right? But you
Mhm.
receive the dividends. So we have to show somehow that these dividends that you're receiving, those are payment for your services working as an executive or manager. And that can be difficult, especially if the dividends are very sporadic or if they're infrequent, like you only receive the dividends twice a year or every quarter. I would say that would be tough. That would be tough unless we can provide other documents showing that, here's an employment agreement. And the employment agreement is kind of like you're going to be performing these services, but it's going to be purely, performance driven based on profitability of the company. And then take out, earnings as dividends and stuff like that. But I would say it would be difficult. So again,
Okay.
somebody who's a sole owner or a small company and they're receiving, their earnings as dividends, it's going to be a tough sled. I would say it's going to be a tough job to try to
Gotcha.
prove to them that these payments are a result of the work they perform and not as a result of them just being shareholders.
Great.
That's that first question. The other question, which is kind of related to this too, is how does a person show their executive capacity and their executive experience? And this is a super important task or aspect of a L1 petition because they really focus on this. They don't focus on profitability. They don't focus on, kind of the business you have. They really focus on, have you served as an executive overseas? And is it more likely than not, you're going to be also serving as an executive when you move to the US. So when they're looking at what you did in your home country, sure, what are they going to look at? They're going to look at what your role was and how that is decided, what your role is and what your job duties were. Usually, again, these are kind of internal documents, so we can work with them and be a little creative, but we have to show that your job duties were almost exclusively executive or managerial in nature. So that's usually a letter that we prepare. It's usually signed by some representative from the foreign company that says, you know, John Doe worked as our CEO for the last 10 years, and his job duties were the following, right? And we have to provide a lot of details and a breakdown by percentage. Like he spent 20% of his time doing the following, boom, 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 boom. 15% of his time doing the following. So it's very detailed. It can be mind numbing sometimes going through this. But the main goal is to say, this is what they were doing. These are the executive services they were providing, and they were working or providing these services or performing this work through their subordinates. So the important thing is to always emphasize it's not like, the client, like, the main applicant, we'll call him, him our client. The client was engaged in business development for the firm. We want to show that the client was overseeing the people who are in charge of business development, right? Because especially for an executive position, which is a little different than a managerial one, but for an executive, they really don't want that person doing first line duties is what they call it. Like first line duties, that's the business development director. He's out there making calls, doing meetings and stuff like that. It's okay if the client is doing some of that, but they prefer to see people performing this work through their subordinates. And their main job is just checking on the subordinates, making sure, hey, they're doing the taxation and the accounting work correctly, they're doing the business development stuff correctly, et cetera, et cetera. So that
Mhm.
gets me to the second aspect of how you prove executive ability is we've got to provide an org chart of the employees that meets these requirements, right? And if you've been watching our videos, and hopefully you have, or some of the other ones, or listen to our L1 guide, which is below in the description, we'll make a plug for that later, is you have to create this, show this hierarchy of employees whereby you, if you're the executive, you're the CEO. Underneath you are at least two, maybe three or more mid-level managers, and then the employees are below you. So we really have to show that structure of employees because that's like proof to USCIS that you in fact weren't, doing all the legwork and, making the phone calls and stuff like that, that you were working through your mid-level managers who were working with the folks beneath them and performing all the services and the work. So that's really important. And they really look at that closely. So if you don't have that three-tier level or more, it could be four or more, but if it's at least, it's got to be at least three tiers. If you don't have that, for example, if you're overseas company, it's just you as the CEO and then like 8 or 10 relatively similarly placed people, that's going to be a tough structure to show that you've worked as an executive. Go ahead.
Yeah, out of curiosity, when it comes to on the percentage aspect, right? Of, we have to say, you did 20% of this, 15% of that. Is there any evidence that we need to provide in order to support those claims, let's say?
Yeah, that's a good question. Fortunately, there's really no objective evidence that we have to provide, right? We don't have to provide letters from employees confirming this. So that, that's pretty much an internal document, internal letter that we provide to CIS, and so it's hard for them to even challenge that, right?
Okay. Okay.
So so yeah, you have flexibility with that. The other thing I wanted to mention is what's important to know too is, as I said, you're at the top level here, then you have your mid-level managers, then your employees. Those mid-level managers really need to have a higher education. It's kind of silly if you think about it, because if somebody's been working for the company 15, 20 years, they only have a high school education, but they know their job really well. You could probably get by if that person had, 12 or more years of experience, because that experience could substitute for education. But for the most part, we tell our clients, look, it's always better, it's just cleaner if we can show that those mid-level managers have a higher degree, because that's
Okay.
usually what they're looking for with them as well.
Great.
So I would say this is one of the issues that most often leads to a denial for an L1, that the client wasn't able to prove what they were doing overseas was primarily executive in nature. And I'd say a related issue that often leads to a denial is in the US, that when we describe what the client's going to be doing after he or she moves to the US, we have to also show executive duties, write out the percentages, what they're going to be doing. That's a little bit easier because that's all in the future, right? But you still have to show that, meet those same kind of requirements here in the US. So both those items are super critical for a successful L1.
Great. Wow. It opens my eyes a whole lot about the L1 visa and the requirements. And I'm sure that everyone that's listening right now that's interested in the L1 visa learned a little bit something on this podcast for sure. So if you're if you're interested in the L1 visa, we actually have an L1 video series that explains the whole process from start to finish, the
In the link
requirements
below.
in the
Yeah.
below. Yeah, click the link below, or it might be in a recommended video in the thumbnail on this video. We also have links to schedule a call with myself or directly with Charles Ray, also in the description. All right, so we want to hear your story. We want to hear what your aspirations are, and obviously help you out to bring your business into the United States. Thanks for watching.
You bet. Thank